I have done a lot of experiments with handling of the sword. Because it's such an unfamiliar type of weapon that, honestly, I have never handled it before, something like this before. A true blade of this length and of this thinness and lightness. So I try to use it in a bunch of ways. I try to incorporate some staff technique into it. I swung it around. I tried to shift my handle, so how to play around with the length of the handle and how I exchange hand with it. I also try certain spear techniques, right? Do a spear technique, how does that feel? I also try a variety of different ways of cutting with it, and just to see, how it would perform. What about swinging like a staff? Or what about cutting like as a more general swords? Things like that. And one thing I found was that there's two concerns with swinging a weapon of this type. One is that because of its lightness, it doesn't have a lot of cutting ability by the weight of itself, which means that because of its light mass, if you only simply do minimal acceleration within a sword and try to cut with it, its own lightness does not allow it to destroy a target and cut into and bite into a target as much as you think it does. And two is the cutting and the edge alignment. So because of how thin the blade is, when you cut with it, it's very easy to lose track of where the blade is in terms of your cutting path. And two is that backhand swings of this way, direction. Because of the way the blade is and how thin it is, it's difficult for the hand itself, especially in the back, to control the rolling of the blade on a backhand swing. And I found that to be quite consistent. Or maybe just I'm out of practice. But in generally speaking though, cutting it down, especially on the right side of the body, on this direction, the hand is kind of awkward because also the length of the handle, that if you put it too close to yourself, there's a lot of rolling instability because of the anchor is very short. There's only a converging to one point, that the blade itself, alignment can be wonky sometimes. If you start trying to have your two hands on the two ends of it and elongate your two anchor points, the chopping path is nice and stable, but still, because of the thinness of the blade itself, you still kind of want to roll this way. You really want to accelerate as fast as you can. And when you do that, the difficulty of control becomes a more prominent issue. So that's kind of these two problems I've identified when handling this kind of weapon. And also you have to ask, it feels a lot like a spear. Should I stab with it? Should I stab with it more than I cut with it? But is that really historically accurate? What about battle conditions that we just don't know as modern people? And that's one of the things about reconstructing things like this that we have to be very clear about, which is it's impossible for us to recreate exactly the conditions that people at the period have met. We can come close, I think we can be reasonable, but we can never do it exactly perfectly, right? So there's a lot of guesswork, and educated guesswork, if you will. We have to look into history and the records and to say what is more likely outcome. What did they think they will be used? So the earliest attribution in history that I can find on the performance and handling of the swords was written by Mozi, which is the Moism school of thought in Chinese philosophy. He's the originator of that, and he existed in early Warring States period. And in his passage, he has written, when you thrust, it penetrates. When you strike, it shears and breaks into two. When you hit from the side, it will not break. That is the advantage of the sword. So what it means is that you can stab with it, you can cut with it, and also it's resilient, so such that if it gets struck by a weapon on the side, it won't break. So a sword is a good generalist weapon. You can do all kinds of things with it. But once again, when we talk about Chinese word for sword, jian, we don't actually know how long it is, right? So long swords in Chinese history, especially the period, is mostly associated with status. As well, when I starting to look at all kinds of records and books written in the pre-Han period, and if I look at the word cut or strike, so when Mozi talk about, when you strike, it breaks into two, he did not use the word cut, he used the word strike. So strike was, or ji in Chinese. But you can tell that when I hit something, it breaks in two, it is more of a cutting motion. In modern Chinese swordsmanship, the act of striking with the first third of the blade in a diagonally downstroke angle, you're not exactly rotating to cut, but instead you're diagonally striking like this. It's called to strike or to ji. So we don't know which it is, because honestly, this is how we say it today in the modern times. But 2,000 years ago, when we're in 2000, did they actually use the same motion to describe that? I don't know. So the best we can assume is that it has to do with more cutting, attributing motion. So that particular word of strike was, if you look up all the records and all the written records of the pre-Han period, you notice that when they talk about the sword and talk about how to use it, it's always associated with the word strike. It's rarely associated with the word to stab or to thrust. If you take a statistical outlook of the period records, what you find is that swords are more used to cut than they are used to thrust. And that is the conclusion that I have to draw from this kind of analysis over the text. Maybe it can be used to thrust, but it is more commonly used to cut, right? It's a generalist weapon, and you have to figure out both. So the next best thing that we can get for detailing the unique passages was during the description in 史记, or the record of history of the written in the Han Dynasty, or the early Han Dynasty, detailing the assassination of the king of Qin. And the king of Qin survived the assassination attempt, and later on go on to unify all of China and became the first emperor. I thought it was an extremely famous incident in Chinese history. Most school children would have heard of it. And within that story, it has the record itself has details of what the king did in order to use his sword in order to overcome the assassin. So we have to look deep into that and recreate that. So here we go. Here I am in my warring state robe. Technically, this is a Qing Dynasty war robe, but for time period we're concerned, this is pretty close. Here I have also put on a separate strap system that is proven to be traditional. There's a second type of a hanging strap, so that the sword itself, I can actually have maximum movement of the longsword. The king of Qing had a situation where in the book he said he couldn't pull out the sword because of two factors. One, it was very long, and two, it is way too tight. So in this case, I can try a bunch of situations, and I do realize that, you know what, I'm having a hard time pulling the sword out. And the only way I found where I can pull the sword out essentially has to do with me pulling my head back and really raise it. In this case, I can pull the sword out very, very close to me. And putting the sword back also is no easy feat. I really have to extend myself, push the scabbard backwards, and then I can pull it back. So in this case, I have tried a bunch of methods, such as leaving it from the back and try to pull from the back. And you know, for my height and my dimensions and the sword, it just doesn't work. I can't do this. So in this case, imagine I'm in a situation where it's really tight and I can't pull it out. In this case, you know, this is not much of an option for me. It's possible for me to do it in a very sort of controlled environment where I'm in no hurry, and I can really change my stance, and yeah, I can have the way to pull out the sword. The king had no choice, right? He couldn't actually adjust him like this. So another way that kind of works for me is if I move my sword towards my back and move the scabbard as high as possible and have my handle towards the back as much as I can. And in this case, I'll pull it all the way out, then bend forward, and from here, I can pull my sword back. And in the book, it was said that people told him to say, in Chinese term, it's called fu jian. The fu means, you know, to carry or push it towards the back. And they never written exactly what they mean by putting to the back, what angle. And from what I've done, I believe, is that the fu jian in this case, this is what they meant. And this is really his only choice, because as the person's chasing you, I mean, you do have your back towards the person. Now the sword handling. Let's talk about the sword handling. So for the sword handling, my biggest problem with the sword is its length, where if I chop normally, right, the way I'm coming down with it, there's always a chance that the tip might hit the ground. And for a reasonably pricey sword, especially considering the time period, you really, really don't want to do that. You don't want to damage your tip. So the only way to do is to really control as it comes down. But what happens is that when you do that, the sword velocity is not as fast. So what I really want to do, from first principle point of view, is that I want the tip of the blade where it does most cutting to achieve two things. I wanted to swing it as fast as possible so the tip achieves the maximum velocity as it traverses through the target. And two is that I do want the impact angle not to be sitting at 90 degrees because the edge is extremely straight. What you want to do is that you want to provide it with a gliding edge angle such that as it traverses through the target, it meets the target at such a way that the blade itself will drag itself across the target. And this is in opposition from the commonly believed angle today, where a lot of blades are curved. And by the curvature itself, you provide the gliding angle. So the hand should have a straight held on a curved blade, but on a straight blade, you'll have to provide the angle yourself within the technique. So what that means is that I want to strike my target kind of within this angle, not like this. And second is I want to make sure that the blade edge doesn't hit the ground at the very end of it. And yet I also want to be able to make it as fast as possible through its trajectory. And yet I want to have enough control such that the angle is good. So I thought about this and here's what I came up with. So let's work our way backwards, right? I want my blade to end up somewhere here. This is because this is the safest angle where I can actually make sure that one, it's not gonna hit the ground, and two, it still faces my opponent at the end of the technique so I can connect to the next movement. I don't want to be in a situation where I cut and my blade is completely in the back and now I'm vulnerable. It's not an issue during a cutting practice, but it's a problem when you're in a battlefield where you're facing components rushing at you. You really want to make sure that you have control and you're not going to lose sight of it. And if you miss your opponent, you have somewhere to recover. So in this case, therefore this is the ideal angle, regardless of where I want to be. And you will see in examples where I try to do this consciously on a cut, but when I do the swing, what happens is that nevertheless, because of the eagerness to cut, when you actually do the cutting, the front hand nevertheless exerts too much force. It's almost subconscious, and the tip will dip towards and below the angle towards the ground. And it's quite uncontrollable, even though you practice it. So the way that I deal with it is that instead of trying to push both hands downwards, what I want to do is get a little bit counterintuitive, is at the end of the travel, I intentionally pull this hand towards me vertically, while the back hand makes sure that the angle is at more or less 90 degrees. So essentially at the end of the technique, this hand essentially makes sure that it stays at 90, and this hand actually pulls towards you a little bit. But of course not that much, just enough such that there's a sudden deceleration of the blade. So at the very end of it, you accelerate, and at the end of it, you provide an active deceleration of the blade. And at the same time, what this will happen though when you do this is very uncomfortable for you at this angle, and you want to provide that cutting edge angle as well, so you counterbalance it with a slight forward lean with the body. So you want to counterbalance it, but as soon as you reach the end of the target, make sure you stand and straighten that angle of your body such that you're not going to fall forward. All right, so that's kind of what I want to do. And so from here, my cutting is more or less like that. So I want to accelerate, and I know my acceleration at here is as fast as I can, and the end of it, I actually decelerate. Once again, right here. All right, and if you compare this to pictures I can find in older manuals, surprisingly they do match. And I have not consulted these manuals before I figured out these approaches. They just happen to be that I think this is only a logical way to deconstruct this technique, and we end up in the same place through a convergent process. So it tells me that I am on the right track with the way I'm thinking about this. So it's similarly, you can do similar things with advancing footstep. In this case, what I want to do is I will simply want to do the same thing here, and right, with a forward stepping, I do the same process where I actively pull back, decelerating it, move my body forward. A very small detail to add is that at the end of the cut, you'll notice that the cut tend to deflect a little bit towards the side. So it's not a perfectly straight cut. You might deflect a little bit this way. So the reason this happens is because as the blade travels from one side of the body to the other side, the edge actually gets a little bit shifted because of the way the body rotates. So I add a detail to counteract this sort of deviation and deflection of the cut. The front hand rotates a little bit inwards like this. So instead of holding my blade like this, I held it a little bit inwards like that. So that here nothing happens. And when you cut, you come down here, and there's a small inward turn of the front hand. So you go like this, and now the cutting path will be clean. So this is my findings from a first principle way of thinking about it, and from a lot of historical manuals in comparison, and I think I'm on the right track. And I've cut a number of targets, and I have consistently proven to be very useful. One additional thing is that it also provides good recovery. What that means is that here I'm able to cut in, and because I have enough control retained with a forward contraction of my forearm, I have a very good way to raise it, right? So here I'm already set myself up to raising my blade. Cut again, I can thrust and come back. So this also allows good transitional recovery. Now let's talk about horizontal cuts. So so what happened in the assassination was that the king pulls out the sword, and he then cuts the left leg of the assassin in two. So the question you got to think about is, I am in a situation where I have pulled my sword out. I rise it towards my right. Now the logical thing you want to do on someone who's chasing you, well, might very well be that I want to cut them to the head. Or maybe that I want to cut them right to the body. So why did the king choose to cut to the leg as a low cut? I think there's a bunch of reasons. One of them is that because of the length of the sword, when you do a horizontal cut with it, it's a little bit, if I do a traditional horizontal cut with an extended hand, right, you notice how by the time my hand's in front of me, I still haven't made the cut yet. It's a little bit slow. And once I'm here, my body is now turned, and it gets very inconvenient. So if I'm moving in one direction, I want to turn toward the other. It feels like a slow cut. And because of the length of the blade, it's actually one interesting thing I found was that this is a very convenient. So instead of trying to cut with my hand turning here and then try to come forward, why don't I just keep it straight in a line with my forearm? So I've cut here, I pre-align with my forearm, and now the only thing I need to control my blade with is rotation of my hip. And this proven to be an extremely efficient movement. So from here, not sure you can hear that, but in this case, I can cut with quite a bit of speed compared to here. See how I am slower on the recovery, and I have to move my body and recover. Here, same technique, I can really recover. And added to this is similarly for the cut this way, where see I'm here, I cut. By the time my hand reaches here, I haven't made a cut yet. So a experienced opponent would strike me already. Instead, I have a straight blade with double edge. So instead of trying to cut reverse hand, I'm going to push my hand palm open, stick it with my forearm. In this case, do you notice the speed of cut which I can achieve? In which means that if I cut with my technique here, my horizontal cut can very similarly be raised, right? These kind of cuts can be combined. So horizontal, other side. And if I combine it with all these techniques, then I am able to achieve quite a larger speed. Another consideration is that he made 8 different damages, or he hit the assassin 8 times once he fell to the ground, and yet he wasn't dead. The assassin wasn't dead, and he was able to have enough power to actually speak. And then it was after that the helpers of the court raised and the guards came up and killed him. So it means that although the king, the first cut was lethal, but yet was not able to finish the assassin with 8 more cuts. And I think the reason really is that the edge is way too long. The person's on the ground, it's hard to get a damaging cut at that low angle, especially when his adrenaline, he's very nervous, very scared, and that's what I think happened. So what I think with the king of Qing, the assassination, what happened was the following. This is what he did in terms of the technique. He couldn't pull the sword out at this angle. I can't either. There's no way, right? So when he's running away from the guy, he turned around, moved across his back, and then he pulled him towards it, opening here with his hand in front of it, downward cut, upward cut. But in this case, because the person's on the ground, see, it's hard for my tip to make a very deep indentation and have my power straight on top of him. So even though I can, do all kinds of stuff, it's not a very powerful cut and at a very low angle. So that's my attempt to reconstruct the events through a bit of experimental archaeology, if you so call it. Hope you enjoyed that.